Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. If you're a mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The NARM therapist training is an advanced clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you are learning and integrating NARM, you will receive individualized support from a team of skilled, passionate, and supportive trainers led by faculty members Brad Kammer, Stephanie Klein, and Marcia Black. If you are working in the field of complex trauma, we encourage you to register now to get trained in NARM. For more information and to reserve your spot, please visit www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. And now for our interview. Christine Marallen has worked with those experiencing incarceration since 2002. She holds a Master of Science in Criminal Justice, a Master of Arts in Theology, and is a certified prison chaplain. She is the former Director of Prison Ministries for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, a position she left in 2019 to further build Damascus, a nonprofit reentry and staffing organization founded in 2015. As the Chief Strategy Officer for Damascus, Christine created and facilitates the Damascus Trauma Reentry Program inside numerous correctional facilities around Ohio. Please enjoy this conversation with Christine Marallen. All right, I'm sitting here with Christine Marallen. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thanks, Emily. So glad to be here. I'm a fan.
We're so happy to have you. I'm so excited to dive into this conversation. The first thing we always ask our guests is, what is it that you would want listeners to come away with from our conversation today?
Well, I mean, there's so much. And that's why I'm so glad that you are willing to extend your podcast to 10 hours today, because we have so much to cover about prison. I got so many questions. I'm sure your listeners are curious. But I think the main thing that I would love to cover is just a combination of the myths and the stigmas that come with any discussion about incarceration and, of course, trauma involved in that. But so many people want to know about prison and corrections and who's in prison and why they're in prison and what happens when they get to prison. And I think I'd like to shed light on that, as well as the work that Damascus is doing in Ohio, inside the prisons, outside the prisons, specifically with complex trauma. It's really important for when I discovered or named complex trauma in the work that we were doing. It's a game changer for those who are incarcerated and those who are staffing incarceration. There's so many ways in which spending time working with complex trauma will change the way in which people will leave prison and hopefully not return to incarceration. I think a lot of people are familiar with this figure. We spend as a nation over $80 billion, and I think it's way more than that, incarcerating people in jails and prisons throughout our country. And the goal of incarceration varies depending on who you ask.
Yeah.
So you may be someone who thinks, prisons are necessary because we need to put terrible people away for the terrible decisions they've made. Or you may be all the way on the other side thinking, it's a place where we can just chill people out and help them reflect and understand what went wrong. Wherever you land on that equation, what we can all agree on is that it isn't working in our country. It isn't working. United States has a very punitive, non-redemptive approach to incarceration, and that doesn't work. So when we look at taxpayer dollars, we can look at recidivism rates. We can interview thousands of staff members or formerly incarcerated people, and we can all agree that it's not working. So I'm here today. I'm willing to say that out loud. And after working with thousands of humans over 2 decades, the reason it doesn't work is because there are very few people who are incarcerated and very few people who are in charge of those who are incarcerated who understand complex trauma.
Right.
And its role in shaping the decisions that lead people over and over again to incarceration. So it's a game changer, as I mentioned, and we're just not simply doing it yet as a nation.
Yeah.
So what I hope your listeners take from this, Emily, is maybe a call to action, if not learning more about it, a call to action in their states to say, hey, we have a solution here to reducing these taxpayer dollars and recidivism if we just take a look at some of these root causes.
Awesome. I've been really interested in, and maybe you've heard a few of our previous episodes where we've talked about post-prison work and folks leaving prison and integrating back into society. So I'm excited to just continue expanding on that and hearing everything that you have to share.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So you mentioned complex trauma and how understanding that can really be a game changer. Can you share with us more about how you're thinking about complex trauma and how you see it really affecting those that you're working with?
I've been doing this work for 20 years, as I mentioned. I went into the system working as a chaplain, so doing faith-based programming. I worked for Xavier University in Cincinnati as a criminal justice instructor. And so I've had different roles inside the system. And without exception, whether it was that or the reentry work that we're doing now, what was common in all of those interactions was that I met thousands of people who, once they were willing to trust the relationship that we were building together, were equally confused about the why. Why do they keep choosing incarceration? And, why are they picking things when they leave incarceration that they know for sure will bring them back? And why do they keep choosing toxic relationships on the outside? And why were they using their addiction as a reason to not realize their dreams? So that common thread appeared no matter what role I had in incarceration. And so a lot of the programming that I developed over the years was to bring people back to a place of that reflection and that curiosity to say, okay, this has nothing to do with the crime that you committed, where you live in this institution, what level institution this is. Humans are humans are humans. And I saw it showing up everywhere. So before we were calling it complex trauma in our programming, what we were calling it was a reflective exercise, a curiosity to get to the bottom of why today's behaviors had nothing to do with today. They had everything to do with things that had happened that they could or could not even remember. And I was seeing that show up over and over again in my work, which is what led us to starting Damascus, and which is what led us to creating the curriculum that we now use in various correctional facilities in Ohio that lead people gently through that process of determining what happened in their childhood that is now manifesting in their adulthood.
So I like how you're talking about using the idea of complex trauma. You were using it as like a reflective exercise in your work. Was this in your work with Damascus? And also, can you tell us more about Damascus?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a both and. So before Damascus existed in my mind or in my co-founder's mind, I was doing the work inside faith-based programming and also in a college setting. And when I say self-reflective, what we did that was different then and now with Damascus is we created an environment where there was nothing prescriptive about what we did. So we didn't set some agenda and say, this is what we hope happens at the end of this time together or at the end of the semester. Working with people individually, we said, you're struggling. Let's figure out what you want from our time together, whether it's my one-on-one chaplaincy time or in this classroom. It's not the same agenda. It's not the same goal. So what I want to provide and what have provided both in the faith-based programming and in our work with Damascus is just the path. So when I say self-reflective, we have gently guided people through these exercises and this curriculum that both gives them information about trauma or about, survival attachment styles or whatever, name the content. But really the work is on the end of the person in the seat who says, this is how far I want to take this, or this is how deep I want to go with it, or this is what I'm curious about. And that may not in any way match the person next to them who doesn't have the same story or the same childhood or the same need to go in whatever direction. So that's what I mean about that. I could share more about Damascus. Damascus was born out of the 15 years of working with people in the prison. And Todd Marallen, our CEO and my co-founder, he came from a business setting, so did I. And so we kind of married our two thinkings about how do we close the gaps that people are facing when they're coming out of incarceration. So it really started as a mental model of how do we change the results? How is it that we can make it so less people go back to prison? And in doing that, went back to, well, people can't stop coming back to prison if they don't understand why they're arriving at prison in the first place. And so, sort of working backward, Damascus became a model for trauma and complex trauma and providing that platform for people in incarceration so that they can then make choices that are based on their coping strategies and their real life story versus this is what you do cognitively or prescriptively to not return to incarceration, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It makes me curious about one thing, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, so we can come back to this if it makes more sense to you. But I'm wondering how you bridge that gap from like a cognitive understanding to more embodied, like, I really get why I keep returning. Is that okay to ask? How do I?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, that's a great question because for years, prison programming has, and a lot of states still does, speak only to cognitive thinking, cognitive behavioral, and those had their place and they're good. And there's a lot of great CBT programming in the world. I think now that we know more about trauma and the somatics of trauma, that those fall short in a lot of ways. For example, there's a lot of programming that say we just have to change your thinking. If you just identify what got you there and you just stop thinking those things, things will change. And we now know, and I knew this many years before we said this out loud, that is not what changes it. If you don't understand why you keep showing up to prison, you can't just think your way out of it. So a lot of what we do to bridge that is we start talking so much about the young child in us. So much of our curriculum is based in the younger version of us, to the point where I have my participants, and imagine this, I have this room of 24 grown men in a high security prison, tattooed and arms crossed, because they're in this classroom with this non-conventional instructor. They have no idea what she's about. They want to know, what does she want from them? And we start talking about the 10-year-old version of them, and they are perplexed. Like, what? Where are we going with this? It's phenomenal to see that transformation from week one, where they are, arms crossed and a little unnerved about what they don't know what's next, and moving through their story, their individual story, to whatever degree and depth they want to go, and seeing them relax, and even bigger than that, the relief that you see on their face when they realize that the things they survived as a child had nothing to do with them, was not about them, was out of their control. And the things that manifested from those survival strategies as an adult are now understandable to them.
Yeah.
It's a huge, huge leap for people who have just been told their whole life that they're just awful people.
I just got chills thinking about, I just had this visual as you were talking about that. I just had this visual of, that process of like what that must be like to feel seen. I mean, that's what I'm really getting is like for them to feel really seen and that their experiences mattered.
It's huge.
But they're not terrible people. They went through terrible things and they had to survive.
And two things come to mind when you say that. For me, I'm always really clear when I speak in public about the work we do, that this in no way diminishes the hurt and the harm that the people in my classroom have actually caused people in the world. Those are real things. I have the luxury of not meeting people on their worst day. I have the luxury of sitting with them after the entire adjudication process has taken place. Whoever's been harmed has had their say, and I meet people where they are exactly in the what now category. So I want to make clear to any of our listeners, many of whom have been affected by the criminal justice system and people who have harmed them who are now in prison or jail, that I acknowledge that those are real hurts and those things happened. And I'm not suggesting by telling stories of where it went well in my classroom that those situations did not happen and that they're not important to people, because they are. But having said that, who do we want coming back home is the question I always ask. And if somebody went into prison perplexed about their own trauma and why they were acting or reacting or strategizing the way they were, wouldn't it be better for all of us if people left with a better understanding of that, so that they make choices in the healing process versus making choices out of the survival strategies like they have been like all of us have been most of our life? That's what we're after. in there. And so we have so many stories of people in our classroom who, for example, we use the ACEs evaluation in our curriculum. And if anyone's not familiar with that, that's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Evaluation. And there are 10 questions on the evaluation that ask people to check yes or no as to whether these things have happened to them before they were 18. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but it's questions about, was someone in their house an alcoholic or a drug user, or was the female in the house regularly threatened or beaten? And those sorts of things. Were they ever sexually or touched by someone? Because that study and that research bears out that the more of those things that have happened to us before we were 18, the more it shapes our view of ourselves and our view of the world. And we use that in our curriculum. And without fail, out of 25 men, 75% of them will have a 6 or higher on that. And there's usually someone who has a 10.
Yeah.
And we wonder as a society why someone who has been through that and that was their normal, why they're making decisions in the world to harm other people. They're the walking wounded. That's not an excuse in any way. It's simply an explanation for why so many people make decisions like that.
Right. And that list, it's been said, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, but I've heard it been said, like there's also things that aren't on that 10 question list that would probably qualify as ACEs, right? They weren't in that original study. And so we're kind of working with that original 10. But I've heard people say, well, my score isn't that high. But then when we get talking and I'm like, okay, well, you've also been through some things that maybe aren't technically on that list, but clearly there was an impact. So just want to chime in because I wonder if you're saying, there might be a few in the group that you're asking that maybe they don't even have a score of 6 or 7, but they probably have been through similar things,
Well, 100%. And the fact that every one of my classes takes place inside a correctional facility, prison is traumatic.
Yeah.
So just if you showed up with a 0, you're leaving with a 3.
Yeah.
That's just the way it works. So, yeah, and you're exactly right. I've heard every story. There's nothing I haven't heard. There's so much hurt in the world, and there's so many things that have happened to all of us as young people before we had any control over it that we are still taking the blame for. And I've heard it all. I've heard everything and heartbreaking stories. And when people pull me aside because maybe they don't want to share certain things on their homework or in the class discussion, and I think I've heard it all, and then I hear another story and I think, how did that person make it this far? How did they make it? And so I've got people in the world saying, I can't believe you're working with those people. Do you know what they've done? And I'm inside saying, I don't know how they made it this far.
Yeah.
I wouldn't make it till Thursday if that were my life. And and I applaud them because they are in my class working hard. There's nothing simple about my curriculum. It gets to a place where you either have to hold up a mirror and move forward, or you have to concede out loud that I want to keep feeling like this and doing these things the rest of my life. There's no wiggle room. And I'm really proud of them. By the time they get to the end, they have definitely looked at their trauma, examined it, and agreed that I need to reparent and heal that younger version of me, or this is what it's going to look and feel like the rest of my life.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I'm at a point where I have so many questions for you.
Oh, good. I hope
and
I
part
have
of me
answers.
wants to rewind and ask more about, okay, this is fascinating. And also I get really curious about, okay, what led you to come to this work? Because you kind of gave us some little snippets, but can you tell us a little bit more about what drew you to this personally?
Yeah, it's not linear and it doesn't make sense. It never does, right? I had a corporate background. I left college and joined USA Today newspaper. I was there for years. And I left the business world to stay home with my children. So I have 5 children. And at that time, they were babies and I stayed home to raise them. And because I was home with 5 little children, I was also looking for an escape in the evening or something, some volunteer work, something that would give me some balance in that role. And maybe this is for another podcast, but I found information about a jail chaplain and instantly knew, despite the fact that it had nothing to do with my prior background, that is where I needed to go next. I had no idea. So I went through the jail chaplaincy training in Cincinnati. I got trained as a chaplain, began to work in the local county jail, and then went back to school and got my master's in criminal justice, and then went back to school and got my master's in theology, thinking, well, this will round out what I need to know about this work because I was enjoying it. I knew I was going to stay in it, didn't know where it was going. And in that same time frame, ended up moving from jail to prison, which is a very different setting, and knew that I wanted to stay in the prison work because you can build a relationship longer with people. And that's really what I wanted, to spend more time, longer time with people. So what I quickly realized is all that education was fabulous. It was a great foundation, and it taught me nothing about what was really happening. There are people writing books all day long about prison who have never stepped inside of one. And to that point, that was me thinking, well, I am highly educated in this now. And it wasn't until I began sitting across from people, simply being present, simply hearing their stories, that I knew there was so much more to this. So all of my worlds sort of collided and aligned. My professional work was as a corporate trainer. And so I was frequently writing things and traveling around and facilitating. And that's really how the role that I ended up in the prison evolved, which was, I was in there as a volunteer and as a chaplain, but I started writing this programming, as I mentioned earlier, about how do we draw from people? How do I facilitate something that gives them an opportunity? Because all the roles that I've had in the prisons and the jails, the one thing that has helped me the most is that I'm not staff. At no point have I been staff. And because there are as many staff members in the system who have no idea what and how to deal with their own trauma, there is a definite chasm and divide between those who work there and those who reside there. And I was not them. I am not them. So I had this luxury of always being someone who was there because I wanted to be there. And that created an authenticity that allows me even today to build a relationship and a sense of trust that most staff members in corrections cannot achieve on their best day. And that's hard news. And a lot of directors and wardens don't like to hear that, but that is the absolute truth. We can both facilitate the same program, and I'm going to get very different results. So that's how I got there. I went to prison. I never left. My kids grew up while I was in prison. They used to tell their friends, well, mommy's not here. She's in prison right now. And even today, I can text one of my kids and say, hey, I'll call you later. I need to go to prison. And they still find that funny. But that is my world and that is their world. And I'm happy to say it's also trickled down into their desire to be part of change in the world as well. So I really am glad I was led on this path. It's a mystery. It's a question I have for God when I get there, but here I am.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I know that that's a personal story, but what I loved about that, and I had an inkling, I didn't know your whole story, but I had an inkling that it was nonlinear and that whatever brought you, you felt called to it. Mm-hmm. And the reason I feel that's so valuable is how many of us out in the world think, well, I'm not educated for that. We might feel drawn to a certain kind of work. And I love what you're saying here is that you felt drawn to it. And so you went back and you got education and you realized, actually, there's another way. Right. So that's really beautiful. I really appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you.
It's really valuable. So you mentioned the work that you're doing and even just what little tidbit you gave. You said the program that you have is not easy for your students. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, because I know that you're NARM trained, I wonder if you could talk about the work that you do and maybe how you are integrating some of NARM into the work that you do.
Absolutely. So the curriculum that we wrote, as I mentioned, is a compilation of things that I saw that worked. And I put that in air quotes, but that worked throughout the years. And so I started kind of compressing them together and then piloted the curriculum. It has things about bias and it has things about, just what is trauma, and it has things inside of it about love languages and, how trauma affects our ability to love. So we pulled a lot of things together in order to move people through what has happened in my life that has led me to the choices that have led me to incarceration. And so we piloted that in a couple medium security prisons, had the groups that we piloted with tell us, yeah, this works, this lands, this doesn't. We want more of this, we want less of this. And then as we were doing that, I was hearing the word trauma, which it has not been used. I can speak for Ohio, and I'm going to guess this is true in a lot of prisons around the country. The word trauma is new, which is crazy, but that's true. Mm-hmm. The word trauma in terms of trauma-informed care or getting staff trained on trauma is new, even though that's the business of prison is trauma. But it's new, and I'm grateful, and I'm glad it's finally happening. But Todd, our CEO, has often said that I've been doing trauma-informed care before it had a name. And that is true, because when I discovered NARM, and I want to share how I discovered NARM, I realized we were aligned, maybe using different lexicon, but I was so excited that there was an organization that was light years ahead in lots of ways of where I was. And that's where I wanted to continue going and deepen what I was doing in the prisons, which is what we've been able to do. So I was introduced to NARM because my personal therapist is NARM trained. Her name is Linda McCon. She's in Cincinnati. She knows that I'm going to be mentioning her name. And I didn't pick her because of NARM. I've had different therapists in my life, but I picked her because of something else, some other specialties she had. But when we started talking in the sessions about my work, she was curious. And so she asked questions and it became hey, let me tell you about NARM. I noticed right away the way she was using our hour was very different than other therapists I had had. So I was curious about that. She was curious about my work. And at one point said, hey, have you heard of NARM? And she talked about Larry. She talked about Brad, gave me the names of the books and pointed me to the website. And so I took the intro, the weekend webinar, whatever it is. And I thought, okay, yep, we're talking the same language, different words, definitely, exactly what it is I want to do more of in the prison. So that's when I signed up for the level 1. And I don't know if I should say this to your listeners or not. I should warn them. It's awesome and intense and worth it and run. Don't do it, but do it, but don't do it. It's so terrifying.
I'm glad you're saying this. Yeah, it is intense. It's intense work.
It really is. I mean, here I was, and I will say when I started it, just anecdotally, because I use a lot of personal anecdotes in my classroom, and that again builds that relationship. When I started the NARM training, it was either at the end of last year or the beginning of this year. I had just sent my youngest daughter off to college, so I was an empty nester. I had just watched my oldest son go to Syria in a deployment. My father had passed away unexpectedly, and I was in the middle of personal crisis. So here I am starting this training with 80 people online and fabulous Stephanie and her magic walking us through this weekend. And I literally was in the fetal position afterwards.
Yeah.
Because to do this training and to maximize the training, you have to live the training. And I was activated and I was an absolute mess. And I'm grateful now. On this side of it, I'm grateful now. And I'm grateful to NARM that is how they lead you through it, which is you have to go through it to go through it. You have to understand it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I appreciate you naming that too. And I think any of us who have been through a NARM training are going to say it gets personal first. It's like we are our first client. We have to live through the material just like you're naming. And all of us have to kind of face, some things maybe that we can't see or that we've been avoiding or whatever. So you're not the only one who's been in the fetal position. I'm raising my hand.
That's so reassuring.
It's beautiful. It's kind of a beautiful breaking open. At least I'll speak from my own experience, but it's a beautiful breaking open because of that, because of the deep work and the intensity. So thank you for naming that and for sharing so vulnerably because it's intense.
It's hard, but it's worth it because how better, especially for practitioners and, in my role, how better to sit across from someone who says, I really don't want to go to that place. And I know my healing is in that place. And I say, I have been there really recently. I understand it. So I am grateful for the experience. Now that it's over.
Yeah, now that it's over. And we'll also say that you did have a beautiful support around you. You already had a NARM therapist. So,
yes.
So we'll just say the level 1 technically is a psychoeducational, training. We're not teaching skills or whatever in OBT. And it does bring up some things. So it's really great if you can get some support from a therapist, even better if you have a NARM practitioner of some kind.
That's perfect. Because I will tell you, even now when I see Linda, it's difficult for me not to flip scripts inside the session and say, oh, wait, what did you just do there? Hold on. I'm curious why you just asked me that. So sometimes I'm in student mode to learn the process. And I'll tell her it's not a strategy. I'm not trying to ignore your question. I just want to know how you came to that question next. Yeah. So I really enjoy it now that I am trained. Yeah. Watching her do it. She does a fantastic job. I can't say enough. I've probably referred 100 people to her. She may cut me off.
She may say no more. I'm not taking any more clients. I love it. So I'm hearing a bit more about how you're integrating. Obviously, NARM is very aligned with what you were already aiming to do. Is there anything else that you see yourself integrating or that feels important for our listeners to understand that you're bringing into your work?
I think it's just the depth of NARM. The NARM model is fantastic in that, as we've mentioned, there is no agenda. That's difficult for both facilitators and I know therapists. There is no agenda, which is a fantastic place to start for us. So we do that, but also allowing anyone in our classrooms or in our prisons post-class who really does want to start the healing once they understand what's happening to do that. So we're available. Damascus is available. What we do spans prison. So our organization was originally set up to close all the gaps. Quickly in 10 years, realized we cannot close all the gaps. So let's at least work with people in the best ways, the most fruitful ways we can while we have them, forgive me, captive. Because once people return home, life happens and a lot of people go do their thing. They're grateful for the experience and we don't hear from them again, which is perfectly fine. But we are set up so that if you are incarcerated, you are in our classrooms, you do want to continue the social support and the relationships with us, that you can do that what we do transcends. And lots of organizations do that. That's not unique necessarily to reentry, but what is unique is that we are consistent throughout. So whatever work you did in the prison, I keep a lot of the work, the stories, the homework, the things that you do, so that when we are now working with you on the outside, we're revisiting, hey, how's this? Where are you with this? You mentioned you want to spend time on this. And just carrying that thread all the way through so that it's not a new relationship. It's not a new, we are in the same space, just a different geography with people. And we employ people on the outside. We have partners. Part of our bigger narrative with Damascus is to really change the narrative on incarceration, which is if somebody really has done the work, has come to an understanding, is trying to change, heal things within them, we as a society have to be prepared to welcome that differently than we have in the past. And that's going to outlive me, that whole goal, but it's worthwhile. We've put over 5,000 people who have felony backgrounds to work in the Cincinnati and Columbus, Ohio regions by meeting with our peers in the business community and saying, hey, this is a good idea. It's good for everyone. It's especially in the face of workforce shortages. Let us be part of your workforce solution because we know who we're sending you. Yeah. We know who is coming to your workplace and we put our name on it and we know what the work they've done. And you will be a proud employer if you take a chance on this person. And it's worked over and over.
Oh my gosh. I just got chills again. 5,000.
At least 5,000. I haven't done actually the math, but yeah, absolutely.
At least.
And all
wow.
permanent full-time work. All permanent full-time work. And something we're doing differently this year, kind of pivoting, there's always new ideas, is taking work into correctional facilities. So now we've kind of flipped the script a little bit and said to our employer partners who have shortages, hey, don't wait for the people to come out. Send us your work. We'll take it into the correctional facilities. And then people can practice learning how to work on our time, under our management. Yeah. So by the time they leave incarceration, they have a $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 check in their hand. And now they've practiced doing the work that you can now hire them to do. So that's a lot of the work that we're focused on now. And it's exhausting and worth it. So we invite, any of your listeners who are interested in learning more about how to do that or partnering with us, please. There's, again, we all know there's a labor shortage.
Yeah.
And there's not a shortage of people. So we need to connect those dots.
That is incredible. Thank you for sharing that. And if listeners are hearing this and they're saying, wow, that's a cool opportunity. Maybe my organization could somehow be involved. They'll be able to reach out to you. We'll leave some things in the show notes and you can talk maybe more a little bit about that. I wondered if you could tell us more. Do you have any specific stories or anything, that you would like to share with our listeners, as you're working with these folks dealing with complex trauma?
I think it's the dichotomy. I know that people are very curious when they know the work I do. They, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of myths about prison, a lot of stereotypes. And so where I can dispel those, I will. But I think people are also just naturally curious, like what goes on in there. So some of the stories that I share with them about the dichotomies where, for example, a gentleman that was in one of my recent classes, if you met him, you would be afraid. He's 300 pounds. He's a hulk of a man. He's got tattoos in all the right prison places. And his story, his ACEs was very high. And his story included daily beatings as a child and foster care, the things that we could script, right? My dad beat me every day. And now I understand that wasn't my fault. And now I understand that the things I do today are my way of coping with that. And it manifests in all of my behaviors. So he pulled me aside after class one day and he said to me, and I do a lot of work with gang members in prison. And as we all know, there's, hundreds of gangs of different varying degrees of danger. And he said to me, "Hey, Christine, he looked around. Is anyone listening? Of course. You know, I'm in a gang." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, I'm a shot caller for and I won't name the gang. And he said, "And I can make a call right now and put a hit on anyone in Ohio right this minute, but I can't feel my feelings. And you know what I really want? I just want to be able to feel my feelings so I can love my kids." And something like that is a moment stopper where I knew exactly where he was because we had just talked about the reintegration of our emotions and how as a child we have to disassociate. And for someone who had to disassociate every single day of his childhood, and now he is a grown up and he has kids, he said, "I know the intellectual way to love my children and I can't feel it. And I want to feel it." And so that's very typical. Gangs are filled with people who want to feel something. So power is what they choose. And I really, really applauded his willingness to say, "I am empty and I understand now. And now I want to heal that. And how do I do that?" And that's the dichotomy. That's the story that happens over and over in my classrooms. When people come to that understanding, I think the whole world needs to see this and feel this and hear this, because this is how we heal it, by people coming forward and saying, "I don't know how to do this, but this is what I want. And I didn't even know that was available to me."
I just want to feel my feelings.
Yeah.
It's so powerful.
Yeah. And sad.
And sad.
And sad. And really sad. Yeah. And it explains a lot. Yeah. So we have dozens of those in every class. There's somebody who has that light bulb go off. It's the best job for me to watch those light bulbs, to be moving through our curriculum and see someone who came in all tough and masked up, and to see that mask drop throughout our curriculum and have them realize that the things that happened to them as a child are real and they weren't their fault. And they've been working from that pivot ever since. And there is a way to heal that. That's so exciting.
Christine, is there anything else that you've learned in your process in working with complex trauma over the years that's helped you that you would like our listeners to know?
I sort of want to circle back and just say we are in a crisis in America in that we're not addressing this in our correctional system. And it is what will change what is happening in corrections. So if I can shout that one more time to our listeners and just say, if you are connected in any way, or you know someone connected in any way that has an influence over this, take a moment and explore this, because what is happening in incarceration across the country now does not work. And whether it's getting our staff trained, our correctional staffs trained on their own trauma and how that's manifesting in the people that they're working with, or a deep dive like we're trying to do in Ohio and Cincinnati, where we are meeting people exactly where they are and working through this with them. We need to address this as taxpayers, as citizens, as people of God, however you show up. Mm-hmm. It benefits us all to look at complex trauma as it relates to incarceration. All of us benefit, all of us win if we do this.
That's a great place to finish up. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's a couple things I just want to say here at the end. The first one, I was looking at your website and there was a few things that popped out at me. I love that you said that there's little that you like better than to see perspectives widen.
Right.
And I just love that.
Yes. That's worth showing up for.
That's worth showing up for. And I think that's what you've shared with us today. Well, all of us are having our perspective widen just a little bit as we understand a little bit more about this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Something else that I know is that you have a book. Is that okay? Can we mention your book?
We can mention it, but there's a sad tale that my publisher went under during COVID. So book, I apologize for not updating that. I do have a book. So if you have a listener who wants to publish it, it is fantastic.
I read the title and I thought, I haven't heard of this book. I should check it out.
Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't find anything.
Maybe we will soon. Maybe that's the whole reason we're meeting today, because our publisher went under during COVID and it took me until now to get my rights back.
Oh my gosh. That's a whole thing.
So please, everyone.
Okay, so if anyone out there is a publisher connected and wants to read this book, I want to read this book. I don't have connections in that way, but you have a book called Good Looking Out, Chapel Girl in Prison. I want to read that book. So if anyone is interested in
Yes.
publishing it, we'd love
I'll send
that.
you the manuscript.
Okay.
You can just get a glass of wine and you can just peruse it. But it's a really fun look. It's a humanizing look at prison and the people I met in my first 15 years. And if nothing else, it sheds a lot of light on just the normalcy of prison and, you know, real people having real lives in a setting that's not normal.
All right. Thank you. So, listener, if you're interested in anything that Christine has shared with us today, we'll have some of those links in the show notes. And thank you so much for joining us, Christine.
Thank you, Emily. It's been great. And I'm so excited about the work you do and the guests that you have on your show. So thank you for doing what you do. And everyone at NARM, very excited to be part of that community.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. If you're a licensed mental health professional working with complex trauma and are interested in learning the neuroaffective relational model, we're excited to share with you about our upcoming NARM therapist trainings. The Level 2 training is a clinical training where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. As you learn and integrate NARM, you will receive individualized support and join an engaged professional community of therapists passionate about healing complex trauma. Learn more about this training and reserve your spot by visiting www.complextraumatrainingcenter.com. The Complex Trauma Training Center emphasizes professional development in support of personal growth. We provide clinical trainings, online webinars, ongoing consult groups, mentorship programs, and community events. Our mission is to provide a relational, inclusive, and depth-oriented professional community for those seeking a supportive network of therapists working with complex trauma. To learn more about our trainings, programs, and events, please visit us on our website at complextraumatrainingcenter.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Elisa Sponseller for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.